There goes Diane, a hyper-intelligent, socially isolated woman who finds purpose in the invisible protection of a man who doesn't know she exists. The blue light of 3 oversized monitors bathed Diane's face in a ghostly electric hue, highlighting the intensity in her dark eyes. In the quiet of her Chicago apartment, the world outside, the honking taxis and the distant rumble of the L train, didn't exist. Here, in the sanctum she called the observer's room, there was only him. On the central screen, a grainier-than-usual feed showed Min-Suk Kwon exiting a black sedan. He moved with a predatory grace, his black suit tailored so perfectly it looked like armor. Diane leaned forward, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't see a criminal or a cold boss, as the tabloids whispered. She saw a man who moved through the world with a heavy, solitary burden. She stood up and walked toward the far wall, which was a chaotic masterpiece of obsession. Dozens of high-resolution photographs were pinned to the corkboard, connected by a spiderweb of red string. There were blueprints of the Dragon's Breath Lounge, thermal scans of his penthouse perimeter, and a detailed schedule of his morning routes. To an outsider, it was the work of a madwoman. To Diane, it was a love letter written in data points. "They don't see you, Min-Suk," she whispered, her voice barely a breath in the sterile room. Her hand traced the curve of a photo where he was looking off into the distance, his jaw set in a line of quiet weariness. "They see the tiger on your neck, and they see the power in your hands, but they don't see the way your shoulder hitches when you're being followed. They don't see the 3 seconds of vulnerability when you think no one is looking." Diane's justification was a cold, hard truth that lived in her chest. The world was a dangerous place for a man like him, and his own men were blinded by their loyalty. They watched his back, but she watched the shadows behind those men. She had seen the way a specific silver SUV had lingered 2 blocks behind his motorcade for 3 days straight. She had noted the new janitor at his favorite restaurant who didn't know how to properly hold a mop. She wasn't stalking him to possess him, she was stalking him to preserve him. In her life of solitude, after years of being the girl everyone looked past, Min-Suk was the only thing that felt real. He was the anchor to her drifting soul. Protecting him was her purpose, the only thing that made her feel awake in a city that felt like a gray fog. She turned back to the monitors, her eyes narrowing as she pulled up the live feed of the lounge where he was headed tonight. She saw the fog rolling in off the lake, thick and deceptive. Her gut twisted, a frantic, rhythmic warning. Something was different tonight. The patterns were breaking. "I'm coming," she murmured, grabbing her coat and a camera bag that felt like an extension of her own body. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving the observer's room humming in the dark, the monitors still flickering with the image of a man who had no idea his guardian angel was a woman with a camera and a broken heart.
The air inside the restaurant was thick with the scent of roasted sesame and aged soy, a familiar comfort that usually allowed Min-Suk to lower his guard. He sat in his usual corner booth, the tiger's den, where the lighting was dim and the exit was always in sight. A glass of deep red wine sat before him, reflecting the sharp, clean lines of his suit and the dark ink of the tiger crawling up his neck. To his men stationed at the door, he looked invincible. To himself, he felt like a man perpetually waiting for a storm. He swirled the wine, but his eyes weren't on the legs of the liquid. They were on the reflection in the window across from him. For months he had felt a prickle on the back of his neck, not the cold, jagged sensation of a threat, but a steady, heavy warmth. It was the feeling of being studied. At first he dismissed it as the paranoia that came with his title, but the sensation was too consistent, too precise. Before I tell you what happened next to Diane, don't forget to like this video, hit the subscribe button, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into it. His gaze drifted to a figure across the street, partially obscured by the brick corner of an old bookstore. A woman. She was barely visible in the shadows, but he recognized the silhouette, the crown of her curls, the stillness of her posture. She wasn't moving like a Fed or a rival hitman. She was watching him with a focused intensity that felt almost physical, as if she were memorizing the rhythm of his breathing. Minsok set his glass down with a soft clink. "Jun," he murmured, barely moving his lips. His second-in-command leaned in. "Sir?" The woman in the dark coat across the street. "Don't look yet." Minsok's voice was like velvet over gravel. "She's been there before. Tuesday at the docks, Friday at the gallery. Every time I think I've lost the feeling, she reappears." His hand moved instinctively toward his jacket. "You want her brought in?" "No," Minsok said, his eyes narrowing as he watched her lift the camera. He felt a strange, dark jolt of electricity. It was an intrusion, yes, but it was the first time in years someone had looked at him without flinching or fawning. She was looking at him like he was a puzzle she was determined to solve. Minsok set his glass down with a soft clink. "I want to know how she's doing it. My security sweeps are the best in the city. How is a civilian getting close enough to smell my cologne without a single alarm going off?" He realized then that she wasn't just following him, she was predicting him. She knew his patterns better than his own drivers. The realization should have angered him, but instead it sparked a dangerous curiosity. He watched her lower the camera and melt back into the Chicago fog, disappearing as if she were made of the mist itself. He took a slow sip of his wine, the vintage tasting like iron and berries. He had spent his life being the hunter, the one who moved in the shadows to strike at the light. But as he stared at the empty space where she had been, Minsok felt the thrill of a different game. For the first time, the tiger had found someone who wasn't afraid to step into the tall grass with him. "She thinks she's the observer," he whispered to the empty booth, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "She has no idea I've already started counting her heartbeats." The cold metal of the handcuffs was a harsh reality check, but Diane didn't struggle. She sat in the center of a windowless room that smelled of expensive leather and ozone, her breath hitching as the heavy steel door creaked open. Minsok walked in alone. He had discarded his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension and the tail of the tiger tattoo disappearing into his collar. He didn't look like a man who had just survived an assassination attempt. He looked like a man who had finally caught the person who had been haunting his dreams. He pulled a chair across the concrete floor, the screeching sound echoing like a scream, and sat directly in front of her. For a long moment, he simply watched her. His gaze wasn't the clinical stare of a mob boss. It was the hungry, searching look of an explorer discovering a new continent. He reached out, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he tilted her chin upward, forcing her eyes to meet his. "Most people who follow me want my head or my money," he said, his voice a low, dangerous hum. "But you saved me. You saw that hooded ghost before my own veterans did. Why?" Diane swallowed hard, the warmth of his touch sending a traitorous shiver down her spine. "Because they look at you as a paycheck or a god, Minsok. I look at you as a man, and men leave shadows." Minsok's eyes darkened, a flicker of genuine fascination crossing his features. He pulled closer until she could smell the faint traces of the wine he'd been drinking and the sharp scent of gunpowder. "My men searched your apartment, Diane Bassi. They found the maps, the photos, the schedules. You've been living in my pockets for 6 months. You know what I eat for breakfast and which route I take when I'm angry." He paused, his thumb brushing against her lower lip. "It should make me want to bury you, but all I can wonder is how you found the one man in Chicago trained to be invisible."
It wasn't a calculation, she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. It was a pattern. The way the fog settled around him was wrong. He didn't belong to the rhythm of the street. I don't see what people are. I see what they disturb. Minsok let out a short, breathy laugh that sounded more like a growl of approval. He stood up and, to her shock, produced a small key from his pocket. He unlocked the handcuffs with a decisive click.
As her hands fell free, he didn't move back. Instead, he took her hand, his thumb tracing the pulse point in her wrist. "You have a gift, Diane. A terrifying, beautiful obsession," he murmured, his gaze locking onto hers with a possessive intensity. "The world thinks I'm the predator, but you've been hunting me this whole time. I think it's time we stop pretending you're a bystander. I want those eyes of yours focused on my enemies, not just my face." Diane looked down at her freed wrists, then back at the man who should have been her executioner, but was instead looking at her like she was the most precious weapon in his arsenal. The line between her obsession and her reality had finally snapped, and as he pulled her to her feet, she realized she wasn't his prisoner. She was his new North Star. The transition from being a shadow to being a weapon was swifter than Diane expected. By the following evening, the cold interrogation room had been replaced by the back seat of Minsok's armored sedan. The air was charged with a new professional electricity. Minsok didn't look at her with the suspicion of a captor anymore. He looked at her with the expectation of a commander. He handed her a tablet linked to a secure network of street-level feeds that his own tech team had been unable to decrypt. "The man you saw at the lounge, the ghost, left no DNA, no shells, and no digital footprint," Minsok said, his voice low as he watched the rain-slicked streets of Chicago blur past. "He is a void. My men are looking for a person. I want you to look for the void." Diane took the device, her fingers flying across the screen with a dexterity that made Minsok's eyebrows lift. She didn't look for faces. She knew the assassin would be wearing a new one. Instead, she looked for the disturbances she had described. She looked for the way the pigeons scattered in an alleyway 3 blocks from the hit site 2 minutes after the shot. She looked for the one car that didn't brake when a yellow light flickered, the one figure whose gait didn't match the rhythm of a tired commuter. "There," she whispered, pausing a frame from a transit cam near the West Side docks. Minsok leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers. The proximity was distracting, the scent of his sandalwood cologne and the raw heat radiating from his body, but Diane forced herself to focus. "He's not hiding in the dark, Minsok. He's hiding in the repetition. Look at this delivery truck. It's passed this intersection 4 times in an hour, but it never makes a drop-off. The driver isn't looking at the road. He's looking at the reflections in the shop windows. He's a tracker just like me." Minsok's jaw tightened. "The docks. That's Lee's territory. If he's hiding there, he's protected by a small army." "He's not protected by them," Diane corrected, her eyes glowing in the tablet's light. "He's using them as a shield. He knows your men won't cross that line without starting a war."
But a woman in a nondescript jacket with a long-lens camera? I can get into the warehouse across from his nest before he even knows the air has changed. Minsok reached out, his hand covering hers on the tablet. His touch was no longer an interrogation, it was a pact. "I don't send women to do my wet work, Diane." "You aren't sending a woman," she said, meeting his gaze with a fierce, unwavering clarity. "You're sending the only person who can see him. Let me go. Let me show you why I've been able to follow you for 6 months without getting caught." Minsok studied her for a long beat, the tiger on his neck seeming to pulse in the dim light of the car. He saw the hunger in her, the need to be useful, to be seen, to be his. He signaled the driver to change course toward the industrial district. "If you lose him, the game is over," he warned. "But if you find him, you'll have the keys to my kingdom." Diane didn't need the keys to a kingdom. She just needed to remain the only person in the world who could keep Minsok Quan alive. As the car sped toward the dark underbelly of the city, she began to prep her gear, the hunter finally given permission to strike.
The transition from the shadows of the industrial district to the gilded opulence of the celestial lounge was jarring. Diane stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror in the private dressing room, smoothed the silk of the burgundy dress Min Sok had sent to her apartment. The fabric was a second skin, bold and unapologetic, with a neckline that felt daringly low for a woman used to hiding behind oversized parkas and camera straps. Her curly hair was pinned up, exposing the vulnerability of her neck, a mirror to the tiger that prowled across Min Sok's skin. When she stepped into the dining room, the air seemed to shift. For the first time, she wasn't the one looking through a lens. She was the one being watched. The sensation was claustrophobic. Every clink of silverware and hushed whisper from the surrounding tables felt like a spotlight. Min Sok was already seated at a central table, a glass of deep violet wine in his hand. He didn't rise, but his eyes tracked her movement with a heat that made the silk of her dress feel suddenly too thin. "You look different in the light," he murmured as she sat across from him. His voice was low, meant only for her, yet his posture remained stiff, his gaze occasionally flicking to the balcony above them. "I feel exposed," Diane admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for her own glass. She instinctively looked toward the kitchen doors, then the fire exit, her mind automatically cataloging the room's blind spots. "I'm used to being the one who sees. Now I feel like a target." "You are," Min Sok said calmly, leaning forward to clink his glass against hers. The sound was sharp, final. "The ghost is here, Diane. He's watching us right now, wondering if you are my lover or my liability. He expects me to be distracted by you." Diane took a slow sip of the wine, the vintage tasting of dark cherries and iron. She forced herself to lean back, to mimic the poise of the powerful woman she was pretending to be. Beneath the table, her foot brushed against Min Sok's, a silent anchor in the sea of her anxiety. She realized then that this date was the ultimate test. To catch the assassin, she had to play the part of the focus, drawing the enemy's eye so that Min Sok's hidden security could finally close the net. "Then let's give him a show," she whispered, a sudden spark of defiance lighting her eyes. She reached across the table, her fingers grazing the back of his hand, lingering over the pulse point at his wrist. Min Sok's expression didn't change, but his grip on the wine glass tightened until his knuckles turned white. For a moment, the mission faded. The trap, the assassin, and the danger of the Chicago underworld vanished, leaving only the two of them in a bubble of shared, frantic heat. She was no longer just his observer, and he was no longer just her subject. They were two predators sharing a final meal before the hunt. "Focus on me, Diane," he commanded, his thumb stroking her palm. "Forget the room, forget the shadows. If you look at me the way you did through that lens, he'll believe every lie we're telling." As she locked eyes with him, Diane felt the shift. The fear of being seen was replaced by the power of being known. She smiled, a slow, dangerous curve of her lips, and for the first time in her life, she didn't want to hide. The silk of the burgundy dress felt heavier now, as if the weight of the night's deception had settled into its threads. After the tension of the restaurant, Min Sok had led Diane to the private rooftop terrace of his penthouse, a sanctuary of chrome and glass, perched high above the shimmering veins of the Chicago streets. The wind whipped at her hair, pulling a few curls loose from her elegant updo, but she didn't reach up to fix them. She was too busy watching the man standing at the edge of the railing. Min Sok had discarded his tie, and the top 3 buttons of his shirt were undone. In the moonlight, the tiger on his neck looked alive, its ink dark and hungry against his pale skin. He looked like a king, surveying a kingdom he was tired of defending.
You've been staring at it since the interrogation room, Minsok said, not turning around. The tiger. You've probably catalogued it in your files. What did your research tell you it meant?
Diane stepped closer, her heels clicking softly against the chrome floor. Strength, authority. In Korean folklore, a guardian that drives away evil spirits. She paused, standing just behind his shoulder, close enough to feel the heat radiating from him. But that's the textbook answer. That's not why you have it. Min-sok turned slowly, his eyes reflecting the cold blue lights of the city skyline. He reached up, tracing the line of the tattoo with a calloused thumb. I grew up in a house where silence was the only safety. My father was a man of many shadows, and his enemies didn't care about the age of the boy standing in the hallway. He stepped into her space, his presence overwhelming. The tiger isn't a badge of honor, Diane. It's a warning. In the wild, a tiger doesn't stop fighting until it's dead or the threat is gone. I got this when I realized my life would never be peaceful. It's a symbol of a life lived in a constant, brutal fight. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to the deep neckline of her dress before returning to her eyes. And now, here you are, wearing crimson like a declaration of war, standing in the middle of a fight you didn't start. I chose this, Diane whispered, her voice steady despite the thrumming of her heart. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the edge of the tattoo. The skin was warm, the pulse beneath it rhythmic and strong. I've spent my life watching people fight from a distance. I was safe, but I was empty. I'd rather be in the cage with the tiger than watching it through a glass wall. Min-sok caught her hand, pressing her palm flat against the ink. His expression shifted, the cold, calculated boss flickering for a moment to reveal a man who was deeply, dangerously moved. The fight never ends, Diane. If you stay by my side, the shadows will never leave you. Then let them come, she replied, her eyes locked onto his. The air between them charged, a different kind of static than the one that warned of assassins. It was the sound of two lonely souls finally recognizing the same battle scars. Min-sok leaned down, his forehead resting against hers, the chrome of the city reflecting in the dark depths of their shared gaze. For a moment, the hunt was forgotten, replaced by a silent vow forged in crimson and chrome. The sanctuary of the penthouse felt suddenly fragile as the digital piece of the observer's room was shattered. On the wall of monitors, a red alert pulsed, a breach in the perimeter of Diane's old apartment. The rival faction, led by the remnants of the Silent Syndicate, had finally connected the dots. They had realized that the ghost wasn't being outmaneuvered by Mafia soldiers, but a woman who saw the world in patterns of light and shadow. By identifying her, they had found Min-sok's only unarmored point. Min-sok stood by the monitors, his face a mask of cold fury as a video file played. It was a grainy shot of Diane in her burgundy dress from the night before, captured by a hidden lens in the lounge. A message scrolled beneath it in stark translated text. The eyes of the tiger will be plucked out tonight. They know, Diane whispered, her hand going to the silk of her dress, which now felt like a target rather than a garment of power. I've become the variable they can't control, so they're going to eliminate me. Min-sok didn't hesitate. He picked up his secure phone, barking orders to his captains. Burn the safe houses. Move the shipments to the secondary docks. I want a full lockdown on the north side. He paused, his gaze flicking to Diane, who was watching him with a mixture of fear and a strange analytical detachment. Sir, Jun's voice crackled through the speaker, sounding strained. If we move the guards to protect her apartment in the penthouse, we lose the shipping lanes. Lee is moving in on the harbor. If you don't send the reinforcements now, the syndicate loses 40% of the territory by morning. You have to choose, the Empire or the girl." The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. Diane felt the weight of the crown Min-Sok wore. She knew the logic of his world. A boss who sacrificed his kingdom for a woman was a boss who didn't survive the week. She stepped toward him, her fingers grazing his arm. "Min-Sok, don't. I know how to disappear. I've done it my whole life. Go to the docks. Save your legacy." Min-Sok turned to her, and for the first time, the cold boss was gone. In his eyes was the raw, primal heat of the tiger. He grabbed her by the waist, pulling her flush against him, his grip possessive and unyielding. "The Empire is just stone and blood, Diane," he rasped, his voice vibrating against her chest. "I spent 30 years building a world where I was the only person left standing. It was a graveyard." He looked at the monitors, then back at her, his jaw set in a line of finality. "Let Lee take the docks. Let the city burn. They think they've found my weakness, but they've actually found the only thing that makes me dangerous." He pressed his thumb against the tiger tattoo on his neck, then reached for his weapon. "Jun," he said into the phone, his voice dropping to a level that made the air turn to ice. "Abandon the harbor. Bring every gun we have to the penthouse. We aren't defending tonight. We're hunting." As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Diane realized the game had changed. Min-Sok wasn't choosing her safety over his empire. He was redefining his empire to include her. The hunter and the observer were no longer playing defense. Together, they were the storm. The air inside the Celestial Lounge was no longer perfumed with vintage wine. It was thick with the acrid, metallic scent of ozone and the gray haze of a smokescreen. The emergency lights flickered in rhythmic intervals, casting long, jagged shadows across the wreckage of overturned mahogany tables and shattered crystal. Diane crouched low behind the heavy marble curve of the central bar, her breath steady, her senses dialed into the frequency of the room. She wasn't just hiding, she was mapping. Beside her, Min-Sok checked the magazine of his sidearm. The tiger on his neck seemed to snarl in the strobing light, his white shirt stained with the dust of the fray. He didn't need to give her an order. He waited for her signal, trusting her eyes more than his own instincts. 3 o'clock, behind the velvet curtain," Diane whispered, her voice a calm anchor in the chaos. "He's breathing heavy. He's waiting for the light to cycle before he moves to the balcony." Min-Sok nodded, his body coiled like a spring. "And the master?" Diane closed her eyes for a split second, visualizing the layout she had memorized months ago from the blueprints in her apartment. She listened to the scrape of a shoe on the catwalk, the faint hum of a radio headset. "Above us, 10 meters back. He thinks he's the observer, but he doesn't realize he's standing in a blind spot of his own making." As the light flickered out, leaving them in total darkness, Diane reached out and gripped Min-Sok's forearm. "Now!" They moved as a single entity, a synchronized dance of muscle and mind. Min-Sok surged forward, drawing the fire of the hooded figure behind the curtain. The muzzle flashes illuminated the room like lightning strikes. While the assassin was focused on the tiger, Diane didn't stay behind the bar. She moved through the smoke with the silence of a ghost, utilizing the path she'd calculated, the one route where the infrared sensors couldn't track her heat signature. She reached the base of the spiral staircase just as the hooded figure lunged at Min-Sok. Diane didn't have a gun, but she had the void. She threw a heavy glass decanter at the overhead chandelier. The resulting explosion of light and falling shards distracted the assassin for the heartbeat Min-Sok needed. With a roar of redirected power, Min-Sok closed the gap, his strike final and decisive. But the threat from above remained. The syndicate master stepped onto the catwalk, his weapon aimed at Min-Sok's head. "Min-Sok, drop!"
Diane screamed. She didn't wait for him to move. She shoved a heavy service cart into the path of the master's line of sight, the metal screeching against the floor. The master's shot went wide, hitting the chrome railing. Min-seok rolled, came up on one knee, and fired upward.
The figure above tumbled over the railing, falling into the fog. Silence reclaimed the lounge, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured steam pipe. Min-seok stood slowly, his chest heaving. He turns to find Diane standing in the center of the room, her burgundy dress torn at the hem, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes, those sharp, beautiful eyes, were still scanning the room for the next disturbance. He walked to her, stepping over the wreckage of his old life, and pulled her into his arms. He didn't care about the territory or the blood on his hands. For the first time, the hunter had found his equal. The game had changed forever. They weren't just survivor and protector anymore. They were the architects of a new, lethal peace. 6 months had passed since the smoke cleared from the Celestial Lounge, and the city of Chicago had learned a new name. Diane stood on the balcony of the syndicate's new headquarters, no longer obscured by a dark coat or a heavy camera lens. She wore a tailored suit of deep emerald, the color of a predator in the lush grass, and her curly hair moved freely in the morning breeze. She was no longer a ghost haunting the periphery. She was the eyes of the empire, the strategist whose gaze kept the underworld in check. Beside her, Min-seok leaned against the railing, a glass of water in his hand as he watched the sunrise. He looked younger, the harsh lines of his face softened by a peace that had once seemed impossible. The tiger on his neck was still a warning, but now it was a symbol of a territory that was finally secure. He didn't look at the horizon, he looked at her. The report from the docks came in, Diane said, her voice clear and carrying the weight of authority. The transition to legitimate shipping is ahead of schedule. Lee's remaining loyalists have been absorbed or neutralized. The disturbances in the pattern had settled into a steady hum. Min-seok reached out, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips. His touch was no longer an interrogation or a frantic pact made in a car. It was the steady, grounding presence of a partner. You saw the betrayal before it could root, Diane. My men don't call you a stalker anymore. They call you the Oracle. Diane smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached her eyes. I'm still just an observer, Min-seok. I just changed which side of the glass I'm standing on. They had built a new order out of the wreckage. The syndicate was no longer a collection of shadows and secrets. It was a sophisticated machine where Diane's hypervigilance and Min-seok's raw power acted as gear and axle. They had turned her obsession into their greatest strength, creating a world where loyalty wasn't demanded through fear alone, but through the knowledge that nothing, not a whisper, not a glance, not a single flickering light escaped her notice.
As the sun broke over the lake, casting a golden path across the city, Min-seok pulled her closer. 3 years ago, I thought I'd be dead or alone by now. I thought the tiger was all I had left. He rested his forehead against hers, the two of them a synchronized silhouette against the dawn. But you saw something else. You saw the man. I always saw you, she whispered. Even when you were hiding in the dark, I never looked away. The cold boss and the black stalker were gone, replaced by the architects of a legacy that would be whispered about for decades. They stood together as the city woke up, two people who had found their reflection in the most unlikely of places. The journey had been dangerous, fueled by a love that bordered on madness. But as they looked out over their kingdom, they knew it was worth every shadow they had chased. The game hadn't just changed, it was theirs to play. And for the first time in both their lives, they weren't just surviving, they were finally, truly seen.